All
Yes,
right.
yes.
Today we are talking about personal stories. And this workshop is going to be divided into two parts. The first part is what makes a good personal story. So we're going to be dealing specifically with the genre of storytelling, the personal story. The second part of it is how you can take personal experiences and have them serve as the basis of other types of stories. For example, a liar's tale or a ghost story or an urban legend. And so that's what we're going to focus on the second part of it, because a lot of times, like for example, a good liar's story, there's there's always that element of truth within the liar's story. And it's how you can take something from your personal life and add to it to make it a liar story. Or there, like you may have had a scary moment in your life and you think, wow, that would make a great ghost story. So then what you do is you take that personal experience and you develop it into that type of story. And we're going to be talking about that during the second part of this. All right, I would like to start out by actually telling you a personal story. And the reason I'm picking this particular personal story is because there's kind of a reminder of something that we need to be aware of when we tell personal stories. All right, so here's the story I'm going to tell. Being from Utah, my family were avid hunters. Every October, we would go deer hunting. Matter of fact, my dad bought a trailer house for that purpose. So we could take it out and camp and get up in the morning and go out and hunt. And I heard a story that I always knew. Now, as some of you may realize, as I was talking to you earlier, I was kind of one of those children that came along much later. My older brothers and sisters were way older than I was, and some of them were even having children before I was born. And so my mother told me one time about deer hunting season. And what had happened is we lived on the outskirts of this small town, and we were so much on the outskirts of the town that it was not unusual for deer or other wild animals to come into our backyard. Now, because we lived on the outskirts of town, we were sort of the last business that you could go to. And we had a gas station, convenience store, restaurant, and, a lot of tourists, truckers that stopped into this restaurant. Now you have to understand this was way, way before I was born. Well, one time mom was left to tend the store, and the practice was mom would tend the store, dad would go out hunting. And if he got a deer, he would put his tag on it and he would bring it back. Then the next day they would trade tags. And then he would go out with his tag again and hopefully get a second deer. Whereas the one that had been shot had mother's tag on it. Well, one day, mom was tending the store, dad was out hunting, and he didn't have much luck. He came home and there was a deer hanging up in the garage. And he said, "Where did you get the deer?" And mom goes, "Oh, well, I was tending the store and I happened to look out the window and there was a buck out in the backyard. And so I went and grabbed your other rifle and I shot it. And then I had somebody help me clean it and skin it and hang it up in the garage. And I put my tag on it." Now, again, this wasn't very unusual. As a matter of fact, I've even seen pictures of my mother feeding deer out of her hands. So we knew that was a remote possibility. Well, every time we went deer hunting, Mom would tell the story about how she shot this deer, how this deer came into the backyard and she had shot it. Well, October came, and I was probably about a sophomore in high school, and we were talking about going deer hunting and the things that we needed to do to get ready. And I remember Mom telling this story. As a matter of fact, this was one of the few times about deer hunting that she never told the story. So I said, why should we go? Why don't we just stay home and a deer will wander in the backyard and mother can shoot it? And Dad and we kind of laughed about that. And then Mom, she looked at me, she goes, oh, Tony, that never happened. I never shot that deer. And we were like, what? And it turned out that she was tending the store. A man came, he had shot a deer, and he decided he didn't want it. He didn't want to deal with cleaning it or skinning it or anything like that. And he told Mom if she wanted it, she could have it. So hung it up in the garage. She found somebody to skin it and clean it out and put her tag on it. The point of it is over 40 years had passed. And before she revealed that that story never happened. Now, I thought it was hilarious to think that I had been duped all this time. But my father was so angry that he looked at my mother and he said, what else about our marriage is a lie? And he was not happy. Matter of fact, he was so angry he did not speak to my mother for 2 whole weeks. Now they finally made up and everything was okay. But I realized something. A personal story, which is a story about your life, is to be regarded the same as history. You have an ethical responsibility to make sure that the contents of that story is accurate. Now, a lot of times when we tell stories, especially about ourselves, we like to embellish a little bit, make the story more interesting. And this was something my mother had a real talent for, if you could call it a talent. She would hear a good joke. And as you know, a joke is basically a humorous story with a punchline. But to make it funnier, she would take somebody that she knew and put them as the protagonist of the joke. Now, one story that she liked to tell, and I'm going to tell you this. My brother, Wayne, was a Vietnam veteran. He had served 2 tours of duty while he was in Vietnam. Well, my mother heard this great joke about a Vietnam veteran. So what she did, and so I'm going to tell you a story, and my brother's name is Wayne. I'm going to tell you the story, how she told it. She said, well, Wayne, he got released on vacation and he was headed home and he was on a bus. And this bus happened to have some other veterans. And he was looking around and kind of thinking, well, I don't want to sit by myself. I'm going to go talk to another veteran. But as he was looking, he would see one, and one of them would be going. And he walked over and he says, why do you do that? He says, oh, that was something I picked up in Vietnam. And he was like, okay. So he moves, he sees another veteran, he goes, sits next to him. And this veteran is going, it's like, why, what are you doing? He says, oh, sorry, that was something I picked up in Vietnam. So he moves and goes over and sits next to somebody else. And this guy is going like this. And he's staring at it. It's like, is that something you picked up in Vietnam? He said, no, something I picked out of my nose and I'm trying to get rid of it. Okay, so she would say that that was something that actually happened to my brother Wayne. Well, so one day, a bunch of us, we were all together, and Wayne was there, and we says, "Oh, mother told us that great story about you on the bus." I was like, "What?" And we told him the story that mother had said. That never happened to me. But mother had us believing that that really did happen. And finally, we just got to the point that we just did not believe anything that mother said to us. After my mother passed away, we would get together and we would tell stories. And then we'd say, okay, now that story came from mother. Did that really happen, or was that one of mother's stories? And to this day, nobody has written a personal history of her because we're not sure what is true and what isn't. So even though you're making the stories funny and more entertaining by embellishing them, you are misrepresenting people's actual lives. Now, mother thought it was funny to put Wayne in this joke. Wayne didn't think it was funny. Okay. Mother thought it was funny to tell this story to dad as a joke about shooting the deer. Dad didn't think it was funny. Okay. So you need to think about that. And a lot of times we say, oh, what difference does it make as long as the story's funny, as long as it's entertaining? But sooner or later, you doing that is going to have a consequence. It's going to come back and bite you. And it could end up being that people end up not trusting you because you have misrepresented what you have claimed as the truth. So remember, whenever you're telling a personal story, you have an ethical responsibility to be as truthful as possible within that story. Okay, just as if you were telling a historical story. And in a sense, that's exactly what you're doing. You're telling a historical story. It may not be about a famous person, it may not be about a major event in history, but it is a historical story. And because of that, you need to be as honest and truthful as you can. Now, some people will say, what makes a great personal story? All of us have stories, but most of us think to ourselves, oh, nobody's going to be interested in that. There's no reason why I should tell that story. And believe it or not, everybody has a story to tell. Now, if you think about it, you all have memories, right? You all have memories. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but you all have memories. Now, to me, a memory is a signal that that is a story you need to tell. The reason that memory stands out so much in your mind is because your subconscious is saying, this is a great story. The reason that you remember me and the reason that I stand out so much in your mind is because this is a story that you have got to tell. So when you're looking for a good personal story, the first thing you do is you look at the things that you remember. That's where those stories are. Now, you may not always think of them. I mean, I don't have every memory predominant in my mind, but a lot of times I'll have a memory. Like I might be thinking of my childhood. I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember when that happened to me. That is my subconscious saying, okay, the fact that this is stand out, the fact that this memory is coming to you right now is the subconscious way of saying, this is a story that you need to tell. Now, if it's a scary story, like, I could remember um, And not all scary stories are ghost stories. Everybody thinks, oh, if it's a scary story, it's got to have a ghost in it. No, a scary story is exactly that. It is a scary moment that has happened to someone. So you could think, wow, that's a great scary story. Now, a lot of times, scary stories are put in the same genre as ghost stories. And I have a story that I tell. I'm not really going to go into detail because I've already shared two personal stories kind of thing. But I have a story that I tell that could be, in a sense, classified as a ghost story. But it is a ghost story that has an explanation to it. It's one of those things that happens and you think, oh, I've got a ghost going on. And then you come to find out it's something completely different. And as a result, the story ends up being humorous. It has a humorous ending because what was actually happening was so completely different than what one thought was happening. Okay. The basis of what this is when I was in Japan. And I mean, I was first in Japan. So I didn't really understand the country. I didn't understand the culture. I was still trying to figure things out. And I got a job teaching English. And the student that they wanted me to teach, it was like a private lesson. And the student couldn't come until after the office had closed. So they left me the keys and told me to lock up and everything like that. And all of the lights were off except for my classroom. And I started hearing this voice while I was inside the classroom. And it was a word in Japanese. I had no clue what it was. Now, I had always been taught that if a ghost manifests itself to you, usually it's because the ghost has a message that it wants to tell you. Well, here was this Japanese ghost trying to tell me something, but I didn't understand what it was saying. And of course, I kept saying to this ghost, I'm sorry, I speak English. I don't understand Japanese. You're going to have to haunt somebody else. And it kept saying this. And it was like the ghost wasn't understanding me and was trying to give me this message that I was not understanding. And of course, and this word that it was trying to tell me, this message, kept saying it over and over and over. Well, my student arrived and could see that I was upset and was like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And I said, there's a ghost. And he says, no, there's no such thing as a ghost. I said, yes, and it's speaking to me. And she goes, well, what is it saying? I said, I don't know. It's in Japanese. I don't understand. Well, right then, the ghost said whatever it was going to say. And I said, see, that's it. And my students started laughing. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't think there's anything funny about this. Well, she explained to me that the word was the Japanese word for sweet potato, and that down on the street around the corner, so I couldn't see it from the window, there was a vendor who was selling them, and that was an advertisement to get people to come and buy it. So my ghost ended up being a recording for sweet potatoes. Okay. And I tell that story and it has a funny ending, but of course, the way I tell it, and and it was really funny because the word is actually yakimo, but it would be drawn out. It would be like yakimo. And of course, it sounded very haunting. And of course, I had to think it was a ghost. Well, last thing on my mind was that it was an advertisement for some kind of treat. Okay, now I took that personal experience and I made it into a ghost story. Okay. Um, but and the reason I did that was because that stood out in my mind. And one day I was talking to some friends about that had happened, and they were saying, that's a great story. That's a great story. You got to tell that story. So I developed it into a scary story. I especially love to tell that story with kids. They just love that. Um, especially when I do the impersonation thing. But a good personal story comes from a memory that you have. And you're thinking there's a story behind that memory, and that's a story that I need to tell. Now, I remember going to a workshop with Donald Davis, and Donald Davis would, he just would go into details. And his whole thing was on how to do personal story. And so he was saying, okay, when you were a child, think of the house that you grew up in. Think of a room in that house, like maybe the kitchen. And then think of an object in that house, like the table. And then think of something that happened at that table. Okay, to me, that was just a long, complicated way of saying you have a memory about that kitchen table, and that's the story that you need to work on. That's the story that you need to tell. So rather than going through a series of exercises, like think of this room or think of this table or think of this, just think of the memories that you have. And the reason that you probably remember them and the reason that they stand out is because it wasn't just one image, it was a series of image that makes a story. So then you say, oh, there's a story. It's already been written. The sequence of events that happened, that's the story. I just need to tell it. I need to develop it and tell it. Okay. And that's where your personal stories come from, is memories that you have. Okay. Now, one of the things that helps me now, before I retired, I taught public speaking adjunct. I was a library director full time, and then I would teach a couple of classes a semester, public speaking. And I always thought that a good introduction to a speech was an anecdote or a personal story. So I would require my students to do 2 anecdotes. But as they were telling their stories, it would remind me of something. In other words, their story would trigger a memory. And I says, I remember that. That would make a great story. But of course, by the time the class was over with and everything, I'd forgotten it. So then I got in the habit of taking a notebook with me. And every time I was reminded of something when my students were telling anecdotes, I would jot down in this notebook what that memory was. And I would write just enough so that I understood what the memory was. Then I would take that notebook and I would say, okay, this is my next story. This is the story I've got to tell. So what you may want to do is you may want to keep a notebook handy. And then whenever you have a memory, you think, oh yeah, I remember that. That would be a good story. Write it down in that notebook. Or if you have to have your laptop handy, put it in your laptop. Okay. So then you can bring it up. And then you can tell your story. Now, one of the things about Tejas Storytelling Association is we do like practice and then perform. And we have created a lot of opportunities for you to perform and try out your stories. One of them is we have a virtual story circle, which meets the 4th Monday of every month. And you could come in, and it doesn't have to be a formal story. It's like, hey, I've been thinking of this story. I'd like to try it out and see what you think. And then you tell your story, and people give you feedback on it. Okay? That's a good chance to practice your story. That's a good chance to find out if it's a good story or if you need to put that away and find another story or what. However, believe it or not, we all have our own little practice circles. We don't realize it. Now, when I was a child, well, actually, I wasn't a child, I was a teenager. I was a sophomore in high school, and I was in a snowmobile accident. And now, what had happened was my sister was driving a snowmobile and pulling me behind on an inner tube, and I was on my back. So I was seeing what I had looked at where I had been, but I couldn't see what was ahead of me. Well, my sister decided to pull the snowmobile next to her van and get off because she had had enough. And I don't know what it was about my sister, what she was thinking, but she headed right for her van. So, in other words, she steered the snowmobile right towards the van. And then when she got to the van, she pulled off, went to the side. Well, now, if you know anything about physics, that inner tube is not going to follow the snowmobile. It's going to keep moving in a straight line, which means it was headed straight towards that van. And I could not see what was happening. Otherwise, I would have jumped off. Well, bam, smack, I hit that van. And that tube was going so fast that it went underneath the van with me on top of it. And I ended up being stuck between the bottom of the van and the inner tube. And I mean, I was literally a prisoner underneath this. And I blacked out and I had all kinds of, for the lack of a better word, I'm going to say visions. And I went through a series of panics while I was trapped under that van before I really realized what was going on. Finally, what happened was they punctured the inner tube, they let all the air out, and I was able to slide out, and everything was okay. But that was such a unique situation. I found people in my family was like, "How did you get under that van? What happened to you?" And so I started telling this story about how I got trapped under the van and what I experienced. Now, one thing that happened. Now, to me, this was a traumatic event. I mean, I seriously was trapped under this van. I thought I was dying. I seriously thought I was going to die. And it was a very, very terrifying moment for me. People were laughing at this story. And I was furious. I got mad. I said, "There's nothing funny about this." And they were like, "Well, sorry, but yeah, there is." And I realized, yes, there were comic elements within that story. And I realized if I were to tell this story, I needed to put those comic elements in it. And so I started telling the story, but I told it in a more lighthearted, dramatic fashion. And people were laughing as I told the story. And I found something that was very important. And you're probably going to learn more about this if you take a workshop later with Gladys Morales, where she's talking about how adversity can inspire healing. By telling this story in a lighthearted fashion, it allowed me to get over the trauma of what had happened to me and see the funny side of it. And as a result, I no longer remember that in a traumatic way, but remember it as like, yeah, that was kind of bizarre. That kind of was funny type of thing. And but I realized also while I was telling this story that people were loving it. And I was realizing this is a good story to tell. This is a great story to tell. And as I was telling it, I realized not only did I need to tell the story, but I realized how I needed to tell the story. And I found this out just in this little social group, people in my family. You have those social groups that you can practice your stories. It might be your family, it might be sitting around the kitchen table for supper, it might be sitting around in the living room. It might be outside on the porch sipping lemonade. Okay, but you have those little social circles, and those are perfect opportunities to practice your story. And by practicing, you tell your story, you get a response. And if people respond in a way, yeah, this is a great story, then that tells you this is a story I need to tell. But it also gives you the chance to realize how it needs to be told. So if you're telling a serious story and people are laughing, that's telling you maybe there's elements of comedy in there that might make the story better. Now, I did not exaggerate. I did not tell anything that was false whenever I told this story. Everything, whenever I tell the story, it's always the true story of what had happened. But what became different was my approach in how I told the story. And that's how you can do that. That's a great opportunity for you to practice your story and find out if that is a story that you need to tell. And I can remember one time I was at a storytelling festival in Oklahoma City, and there were some vendors outside, and they had tables and everything. And a bunch of my friends and I, we were sitting around, and they, they said, "Oh, you live out in the Panhandle of Oklahoma. So what's that? What?" And there was a little town called Slapout, and I told this story about something that happened to me while I was in Slapout. And I really didn't think much of it. I didn't think, oh, that's not that big of a story. But as I told this story about this place, this building that I had seen in Slapout, my friends were going like, wow, that really happened to you. And I said, yeah. He says, oh, Tony, that is a great story. You've got to develop that and tell that story. So I took that story and I developed it and I told it at the next festival. And everybody was like, yeah, Tony, that's a good story. Okay. So your little social circles could be the way of saying, this is a story that I need to tell. And it's a great opportunity to tell stories in different ways, to say, this is how I need to tell that story. All right, now, okay, we're getting to the second half here. And I'm not seeing hands up, so I'm guessing there's no questions. And I'm going to try and wrap this up and leave some time where we can also ask questions. Last, well, not last year, last festival, but the year before that, I told in the Liars Contest, I took third place. And what I did was I took an incident that had happened to be in my life. Now, when I was a senior in high school, I had this plan. I was going to take all my general eds, I was going to get them out of the way. My senior year, I was going to do nothing but take fun classes, and I was just going to play my whole senior year. But apparently, my principal had a different idea because he took every single one of those classes that I wanted to take and he put them first hour. And he put all these other hideous classes that I had no need for. The only reason people took them was because they needed a general ed requirement. I was put into things like physics, chemistry, geometry, and sociology. And I hated every one of them. And I got really angry at the principal. And he was like, there's nothing I can do about it. Now, it turns out I was one of the contenders for an award that was called the Sterling Scholar. And they would have these in different categories, one of which was speech and drama. Well, two of the classes I wanted to take was advanced debate and advanced drama, so that I could be in the plays and I could compete in the speech tournaments. That way I could get the Sterling Scholar Award. Well, there were three other students besides myself that wanted to take those classes and could not be in them or could not be in both of them. thus making it so that they could not be the Sterling Scholar. And we were the top four contenders. And all of the parents got really ticked off and went to the principal and said, "You are making this so that my son or my daughter cannot be the Sterling Scholar in speech and drama." And the principal was like, "Oh, yeah, you're right. I did." So he ended up coming up with compromises for those students so that they could be in the plays and they could compete in the tournaments. And the compromise that happened to me was he put me in as a teacher's aide in the beginning classes. So that way I could still be eligible to compete and be in the plays. But when the principal first said, "There's nothing I can do about it, basically suck it up and deal with it," I started thinking of ways that I could get even with him. But he came up with this compromise and I was fine. Well, when I was trying to think of a good lie, I said, what if I took this incident where I was mad at the principal, and what if I did this to get even? What if I did this? What if I did this? And I thought, that would make a great lie. That would make a great liar's tale. So I started out with a premise of a historical story or a personal story, and I started adding things to it. Now, what had happened in my high school, one of my classmates streaked. And I thought, what if that was me? What if I was the streaker? Um, Now, one of the things that I did do to show my rebelliousness was at the end of the school year, I climbed up on the roof of the building when people were coming to the graduation ceremony, and I was dressed as the angel Moroni, which appears on top of Latter-day Saint temples. I had our school colors was purple and white, and I had a long purple graduation gown. And I went and got a cornet out of the stage shop, and I climbed up on top of the roof and posed as this angel as people were coming in graduation. And of course, they wanted to withhold my diploma, and they couldn't do that and everything. And it ended up, but I thought, for the sake of the story, I'm going to put that as one of the things that actually happened when I ticked off the principal to get my way, so to speak. I also heard a story about somebody who had done a sociology project and they popped placebos and then pretended that they were high on the drugs. And I thought, what if that was me that did that? So I took those things and I incorporated it into the lie about how I was able to get my way, so to speak. And that was the only time in high school that I was ever a really bad person. The story is titled "The Year I Was Bad." And I ended up taking third place. There was a lot of people who thought I should have taken first place in it. But the point of it was is I took that incident that happened in my life and I started adding to it. So it became the basis of a great liar's tale. I told you the story about me in Japan and how I thought this advertisement was actually a ghost. I turned that into a great scary story. And you can do that. There's a lot of things in your lives you can say, well, maybe that isn't the makings of the story. But maybe if I added this to it, or maybe if I added that to it, then it would make a great liar's tale. Then it would make a great scary story. Then it would make a great urban legend. Or then it would just make a great adventure story kind of thing. And so some of the best inspiration that you can get for telling stories are from things that happen to you in your own life. But again, I emphasize, if you're going to pass it off as a personal story, you are basically saying, this is something that really happened to me. So you have that ethical responsibility that you need to keep it accurate. Once you start embellishing to it, and once you start adding to it, it is no longer a personal story. You may call it a personal story, but it's not. Then it becomes something else. It becomes a liar's tale, or it becomes an urban legend, or it becomes a legend, or it becomes something else. And you need to be aware of that. All right, we have a little over 10 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Or did I so overwhelm you that you just have to meditate on this for a while? All right, Mary, looks like you've got a question. Unmute yourself and then ask your question. Margot, I'm sorry, Margot.
Oh,
The print
okay.
is very, very small here. I'm trying to.
I can't see either. FYI, I took third place this year in the Liars competition. So it was half the story was true, and then the last half was the lie. But anyway, my question is, what if you're telling a personal story and you get to a part and you say, "Okay, I'm going to exaggerate this next part," or this didn't happen this way, but this is the way I would have liked it to have happened if I could have. Or just say something that tells the listener that you're embellishing so
Yes,
that, yeah, it
yes.
kind of
As long as you are
resonates.
stating this is not true, then you are not doing anything unethical.
Okay.
And that can actually make a great story. It's a, you know, you could even start out and say, I'm not going to tell you what happened. I'm going to tell you what should have happened or what I would have liked to have happened. And then you're okay. But and the thing is, and this is especially true with children. Now, it's not a personal story or anything like that, but I tell a scary story called Black Bubblegum, and it's about children that go out trick-or-treating and they find this black bubblegum and it's magic and it causes all kinds of things to happen. Now, children are very, very impressionable. And I say, now this happened to two little boys while they were out trick-or-treating. So pay attention because this might happen to you. Now, those kids are impressionable. And as ridiculous as that story is, as obviously ridiculous as that story is, those kids will walk away thinking that that really happened, that that was a true story. So at the end of the story, I say, hey, this never happened. I made it up, folks. You know, there's no such thing as black bubble gum that does all this stuff. Okay. And I realized that because when I was first telling the story, I would talk to kids afterwards and they would say, wow, that really happened. Did you know these two kids? And I go, no, that was a made up story. And I realized, oh, that story is being, whether I intended it or not, is being passed off as true. And people are believing that that story is true. And so from then on, whenever I told that story, I says, this is not a real story. This is made up. Okay. And because I don't want them believing something that is false.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to be very careful in doing that with a lot of things. Um, not just personal stories. By the way, as something else too, if you are telling a personal story about a family member, the rule of thumb, and I think it's the law, but you cannot tell a story about anyone that is living without their written permission. So if
Wow.
you are telling a story about a family member and that family member is still alive, you need to make sure that they are okay with you telling that story
Mhm.
and that that you have their permission and it needs to be written so that you can tell that story. So
Mhm.
just something to think about. Okay, Mary, Yes.
Yes, I do have a question. Okay, so I took your class yesterday about
Mhm.
the components of how you put together a story. So when you do a personal story, do you take those same components that you were talking about? You know, the opening has to have a catch to it. And so you would just apply whatever you had shared with us yesterday to these personal stories.
Mhm. Yes. That formula
Right.
basically applies to any type of story except the long form tale and the fringe, which are really more like novels than stories.
Yeah.
And but as a matter of fact, the snowmobile story, I talk about three things that happened to me while I was under the van. That
Mhm.
is my three because of that. Like the
Yeah.
first thing that happened was I thought I had died
Yeah.
because everything was black. So I
Yeah.
literally thought I was dead. And because there wasn't a light, I thought I was going to hell.
Mhm.
Then I started feeling pain. And I realized if I was dead, I couldn't feel pain. But it was still black. Everything was still, you know. So I thought, oh, I'm alive, but I'm blind.
Mhm.
Then I start seeing the shapes and I realize I'm trapped under the van and I start crying for help.
Mhm.
So that's my three because of that.
And I would agree with you totally about children because I've worked with children all my life, but you're right, they cannot distinguish when they're young between fantasy, you know, fantasy and the truth. And so I'm glad you said that because they can't distinguish sometimes between that. You
They
know,
can.
yeah,
So you have to be very, very careful the stories that you tell to children. And if it's something that could be very easily conceived as a true story, you need to make them aware. This is not a true story. This is made up. And I didn't realize it. Honestly, I thought that story was so ridiculous and so obvious false that
right.
it never occurred to me that a child would believe that really happened
Yeah,
until I started talking to the children. They go, "Yeah, that was a true story. You told a true story." And I'm like, "No, I
yeah,
did not."
yeah,
And that's what made me aware of that. And then I said, "Okay, from now on, when I tell the story, I need to make sure that they understand that's a made up story."
yeah.
And all of the stories that I tell to children, I look at it, is this a story that they could think is something that really happened? And if it
Mhm.
is, what do I need to do to make sure that they understand that it's not?
Yeah. That's really good.
So,
Thank you.
okay, we have 5 more minutes. Comments, questions?
I just want to make a quick comment on what Mary just said. I studied Montessori, and what Dr. Montessori found was before the age of 7, they can't distinguish between reality and fiction.
Yeah,
So yeah. Just I was trying to figure out where to type it in the chat, but with the other things up, I couldn't find it.
That's where I got it from because I worked in a Montessori school for several years.
Yeah.
yes.
I worked with up until seven-year olds, so I had to be careful. So I
Okay, Tom, looks like you have a question.
had to mute myself.
I okay, we're not hearing you. So maybe your volume, you're unmuted. No, you're unmuted, but we're not hearing you. Maybe the volume on your computer needs to be turned up.
Mute.
Oh, okay. All right. I saw another hand, but then it disappeared. Oh, okay, John.
So I have a story that's kind of absurd, and I would tell. It was basically I stretched the truth about a story about my mom, and she was a funny storyteller herself. But I realize now maybe instead of making my mom the centerpiece, I can just make up a character and just say this woman took a trip to Hawaii, and then
Mhm.
go with that rather than because yeah, that's true. But now she's passed, and their grandchildren might hear one of those stories or see it on YouTube and think that it's reality. So, yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to mention, Bill Lepp, he always slowly increases the absurdity in his stories. So by the end, it's obviously tall tale. And then some other storytellers, like, they'll make something at the very end that goes, and that's the way I remember it. Though everybody else in town says that exactly is not what happened. Something like that, so that you realize he's just messing with you.
Right.
That's all I have.
Well, and if you say this is how I remember it, then you're letting the audience know this may not be true, but this is how I perceive it. And so then the audience can walk away and say, well, okay, yeah, this is what he said, but I don't know if I'm going to totally believe it. So, but ethically, you're okay. You fulfilled your ethical responsibility, so to speak. Okay, I think we have 2 minutes. So unless somebody has a really short question or comment, that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. I am free to anyone. If you look in the folder, my contact information is there. You are more than welcome to email me or text me. Please do not call me. A lot of times when people call, they call right in the middle of a performance or a workshop, and I can't answer it. So text me or email me, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can. But I will be more than happy to help you with anything. Also, I'm one of the people that is in charge of the Art of Storytelling Masterclass. And people have wanted to know if they could turn in a workshop, a proposal so they could teach the class or a workshop for anything else. And I've said, submit it to me, let me look at it, I will critique it, and then go ahead and submit it to wherever you want to do this workshop type of thing. And I'm available to do that. So if you have any questions, concerns, anything like that, I will be happy to help you in any way that I can. But never call me. Last year I was at the Spirit of Oklahoma Storytelling Festival, and I was telling a ghost story. And right in one of the climatic moments, somebody from my church called me. And I warned everybody. I said, do not call me, especially tonight when I'm performing. And either somebody didn't get the message or something, but my phone went off. And did not go over well at all. So text me or email me. All right. Thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And we will see you all later.